Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Shvis Perek Yud Halacha Aleph. We're learning today Daf Pei. We're going to start Mamish on top of the Amid. It's a whole new world over here. We're learning now about the laws of Shemitah, about the positive commandment and the negative commandment, which is to relinquish debts that originates from a loan on Shvi'is. Again, to remind ourselves that there's really a machloikes rishonim, whether it's miket sheva shanim, whether it's at the end of the seventh year, whether some of it begins l'rosh, the lav of lo yigois begins at the end of the sixth year. We meaning the Alter Rebbe paskins to be machmer like both opinions, which is why we write or we articulate the prusbul both Erev Rosh Hashanah going into the seventh and Erev Rosh Hashanah going into the eighth. And we just left off in the Gemara on Daf Ayin Tesamid Beis when we quoted a Braisa speaking about a man who designated a property for his wife to collect if she'll ever have to collect the ksuba. In other words, he made an apoiteke, apoitehekoi, or he was miyachid lo karka, and nevertheless, the Braisa says that she always has an option, that if she wants, she can collect it from the land that was designated, even if that land was sold to someone else, even if it's biyad lekuchais. But on the other hand, she doesn't have to go to the lekuchais. Even though he designated the property, if she wants, the woman can collect it from any other property she wants. And the Gemara clarified that was the end of Daf Ayin Tesamid Beis, that really it depends. If the person told his wife, or he documented to his wife regarding that land, that lo yiyelecha piroin elo mizeh, you may not take payment only from this one, which is called an apoitike mefoirash, then she will not be allowed to collect her ksuba debt from any other land other than this one. More convenient, less convenient. That's called an apoitike mefoirash. But if he was miyached karka, but he didn't say that you may not collect from anywhere else other than from this one. He just said it in the positive. This is designated for your ksuba. Even though this designation was made, she is, if she wants to collect it either from this one or from any other property. And now the Gemara today on Daf Pei on the top will begin quoting other debts, as we will see, in which there will be again this nafkamina, this differentiation at the end of the day, whether there was an apoitika mefaidish or whether there was a apoitika stam. Now, we're going to go back to the Mishnah the whole time. The Mishnah told us that a ksuba debt, right, normally is not going to be canceled by Shemitah. That means even if a man divorces his wife before the seventh year, before the end of the sixth year, since it doesn't originate from a loan, so Shemitah is not meshamet. Nevertheless, we will see a machlekes Rav and Abchia that there will be times, depending how much is needed, but at some point, the ksuba will be transferred into, legally, it will be viewed from now on as a debt that is a chayiv. And if such a thing were to happen, we'll see how that happens, then Shemitah will be meshamet. The Gemara today also will point out, will explain the stira that we right away said when we learned the Mishnah, and the stira was an obvious stira. First, the Mishnah said that when regarding a store credit, number one is not a loan. But then there was a machlekes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. Both agreed to the concept that even a store credit could be transferred into a loan. The Tanakama says the word simply that if asa a milva, we spoke at yesterday, a machlekes rishonim, let's just go with the Rosh, at the moment the storekeeper tells the client, tells the customer, you have up until a certain date to pay what you owe in the past. When you set a date for payment, that makes it into a loan. And therefore, Shemitah will be meshamet. Rabbi Yehuda says the words harishain meshamet. If you remember, what that means is that a storekeeper, when you buy something and don't pay, that's still called a store credit. It's not called a loan. Even though you can argue the guy lent him the produce, it's not viewed as a chayiv originating from a loan. But the moment the customer makes a second purchase, and the storekeeper again extends credit, the storekeeper, this is the logic, you don't extend credit to someone who still owes you from the past. And why do you do it? When you do it, if you do it, that's because you view the past as a bona fide chayiv loan. And now you're giving the person one store credit. It's almost like you closed that parsha, even though the guy didn't pay because it was transferred into a loan. That is the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. Be that as it may, the Mishnah spoke about a case where an animal was geschachten on Rosh Hashanah, or Erev Rosh Hashanah. If you remember that on Chavtas Elul, it was distributed on the next day. The next day could be Lamed Elul, or it could be Echad B'Tishrei. If it turns out that the Chodesh became a Uber, in other words, that the meat was actually given to the clients on what we know now to be the last day of the year, not the first day of the new year, now we view it as a chayv, and now Shemitah's Mishamit. That's what the Mishnah says. The problem is, we just established that any store credit in itself is not viewed as a loan, and Shemitah's not Mishamit on the store credit. Store credit will not include a shoichet giving out meat. That's called a store credit. It's a blatant contradiction, and the Gemara today will resolve the contradiction. Now, we're going to go on. God, we'll see how far we can get. The next part of the Mishnah speaks about schar sachit. Same thing, that workers' wages that weren't yet paid is also not viewed as a loan. Shemitah is not mishamet. And again, the Tanakama says, imaso milva mishamet, whatever that means. And Rabbi Yossi says, and I'm going to quote the words of Rabbi Yossi, that kol melacha shehi poisekas b'shvi'is. When we learned the Mishnah, we learned inside the Marafulda. The Marafulda is going to quote Shitas Rabbi Yochanan that God willing will still happen in today's daf. That explains the Mishnah in one of the two ways. There are two ways of explaining the Mishnah. Way number one is that if the worker is doing work that may not be done on Shemitah, on Shvi'is, and that work ended before Shemitah, before Shvi'is, then Shemitah's Mishamit. But if the worker did a type of work that is not prohibited to be done on the Shvi'is here, even though as far as the worker is concerned, he was hired for the day, he doesn't know whether he's going to be rehired tomorrow. That type of worker's wages, Rabbi Yossi says, is not considered a chayv, and Shemitah will not be mishamit. Again, what the meaning of melacha shehi poisekas b'shvi'is means, machlekes Rabbi Yochanan and Eish Lakish. Today we're going to have the shitas of Rabbi Yochanan, which is exactly what we just explained when we learned the Mishnah yesterday in the Marafulda, and we'll see today or tomorrow we're going to come to a whole new understanding of the Mishnah. This is Daf Pei. Daf Pei Amud Aleph on the top. Again, coming back to the last topic, by Ksubas Isha, we clearly differentiate between an apoitika mefoirish versus the apoitika stam. The braisa that we just had on Daf Ayin Tes Amud Beis is only speaking about an apoitika stam. And now let's move on. Me'ingen le'ingen ba'oisa ha'ingen. Says the Gemara, ha'mishabeit sada lechaveroi. For any type of debt. So let's say it can be a loan. Person lends money, and the borrower secures that one of his fields, he's mishameh, that's he's meyachet sada, he's mishabet sada to his friend. Now, he went ahead, the borrower went ahead, and he sold the field. Now, we all know that. Seder. So the field, these are the words, are biyad lekuchais. If when the debt is due of cash, it will not be paid, so then the lender will be able to take the field, even though it's already in the hand of a purchaser. We want to know one thing. When you designate a field and then you sell it, is the sale a sale? Lamay nafkemina. Is the buyer allowed to eat the produce? Elama, the buyer knows that in a couple of days or a couple of months or whenever the time comes to be, and the debt, if the debt won't be paid, he's going to lose the field. But up until then, the field belongs to him. Or do we say that since this field was miyuchet for a loan, now guys, let me speak this out by heart and we'll read the words in the Marafulda. Think about it. The buyer, when the buyer buys something and he knows that this might be taken away from him, from a creditor, what will the buyer then do? The buyer will go to the seller, who's the borrower, halkop, and he's going to get his money back. Now, if the buyer will be allowed to eat the paytas of that field prior to getting his money back, it's going to come out at the end that when he gets his money back, he got his money back, plus the paytas that he ate until when the lender, the creditor, took the field away. So there's a ribis issue over here. On the other hand, you can argue there's no ribis because what he bought is his. The field is his. Later on, since this field was linked to a loan, if he loses the field later, okay, he'll lose the field and he'll get his money back. So there's a machlekes amiroin. So machlekes between Rabbi Acha and Rabbi Yosef. It's geschmack, chavre, for those of us who have been spending already years learning Zerayim. We're coming back to sugyas that we are very familiar with in the Bavli. Let's call this the Yeshiva Shemesachtes. So Rabbi Acha Amar Mechura L'Shah, which means that the buyer is allowed to eat the paytas of the field, even though at some point he's going to have to give up the field. Rabbi Yossi says, Eina Mechura L'Shah. We don't even view it as a sale at all, meaning we view the field to already be in the possession of the creditor. We view the money that the buyer gave the borrower, we view that as a loan. That money will be given back to him. But he's not allowed to take the money back plus eat the paytas. So Taichas the Marafulda. Let's quickly read it on the top and the up. Mechura L'Shah. Okay, the first shita, the shita of Rabbi Acha, until when the field will be collected for the original debt by the creditor, he's allowed to eat the product of the field. And what's the chiddush? And we don't say, since this field was made into a apoitika, he was miyached loisadam. It's not even considered the sale. And therefore, we view the money that the buyer gave to the borrower as a halva'ah. And if that were to be the case, if we were to view it that way, then the buyer cannot eat the paytas. Then the paytas has to go to the moicher. Because if the buyer will be allowed to eat the paytas, then there's going to be, of course, it's not ribis ktsutza, but it's a mechzek ribis. Because he lent money, he's going to get the money back, plus he's getting the paytas. Rav Acha says we don't view it that way. We don't view it as a loan. We view it as a bona fide sale. Mechura, even though it's l'shah. I'm saying l'shah because the lender is going to collect it from this field. However, Rabbi Yossi says no. Since it's made it into an apoitika, we don't consider it a sale. We consider the monies exchanged as a new loan that the buyer lent. He gave him money. He gave him money to buy the field. No, he loaned him money. So it's still in the shoes of the borrower. And the buyer is going to get the money back. When the creditor is going to get the mony back. But we don't want him to get his money back plus pay this. Gavaldik. Very good. Very good. In other words, if it belongs to the buyer, then he's allowed to eat the paytas. It's called mechura, even though it's only l'shah. If you're going to say that it's not even mechura l'shah, Rabbi Yossi, then he can't eat the paytas. Says the
Rabbi Yossi, according to Rabbi Yossi, the guy that bought the field, who he's saying it didn't really buy it, does he have the right? Does he have the right to sell it to somebody else, or?
So I would say that even according to Rabbi Yossi, him selling it to someone else does not involve ribis. The issue is not ribis. It's just about people lending and borrowing money from each other and leaning on the field as some sort of guarantee.
Right. I'm not talking about ribis. I'm just saying, like, it almost sounds like, according to Rabbi Yossi, this guy that's a buyer, he really is not a buyer.
Correct. But I would still say, Danny, that since the issue is only ribis, perhaps he will be allowed to sell the field because we will again view that as another loan. If the buyer needs money, and he's going over to you, Danny, and he's telling you, I need a loan of $1 million, you won't give it to him. When he sells you the field, then you know that it's ke'ilu, you're giving him a loan, but you're taking the field as some sort of collateral. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, chele, right? Yasher chela, koyach. Chele means a proof. Chele, the Rabbi Yossi, the koyach of Rabbi Yossi, is min hadah. What's min hadah? So this is a statement that shoir matzoi hu lahavrichoi regarding an ox. And an ox is something that sometimes people would have designated an ox as a guarantee. Now, of course, designating an ox, nothing better than designating land. No doubt about that. But sometimes people would designate a movable item, like a car today, as a guarantee. Look inside the Marafulda, the fifth line in the top. In other words, the Yerushalmi is Mekatzer. There are certain things we have to know, which is Shoiroi, right? The first narrow line. Hod the Kaimelon. It's known. That what? That also Shoiroi Apoitika. Someone made a loan. And they used the borrower designated the borrower's ox as a apoitika to a lender. And then the borrower sold that ox. Everyone agrees, umacharoi mecher, right? Umacharoi mecher. And why is that? So Rabbi Yossi, and don't forget, Rabbi Yossi is the one that says that by a field, it's not a sale. Of course, chele. Why? Let's keep on reading the Marafulda. Yeah, we know why. Because when a creditor lends money based on a guarantee from an ox, the creditor knows it's not a guaranteed 100% foolproof security. It's not that. Why is that? It's possible for the ox not to be there. Any movable can disappear. In other words, since the creditor doesn't really fully rely on the ox, so we view the ox as the property of the borrower, and therefore he has the right to sell it to a lekeach. Inside the Gemara now. Shoiroi, since matzai hula avrichai, which is why the sale is effective, because the creditor doesn't really own it. He knows it might not be there available when he's coming to collect. And that's the difference between metaltalin and karka. But sada, since einoi matzui lahavricha, you can't make land disappear. Therefore, the creditor views the land as it is. Or let me say it better. That's Rabbi Yossi. We view the land to already be in the possession of the creditor, and therefore, what the borrower did is really it's a new choiv. It's not a sale. Says the Gemara. Hold on. Are you telling me that a land can never be depossessed from someone? Forget about the borrower selling it. The borrower didn't sell it. Isn't it possible that a mafioso guy will come and he will force the land out of the hands of the borrower? We have all these mishnayos, and I think it was in Gittin, right? That's how the Romans used to do. They used to force you to sell it. Or even Stam, a lekeach who's a mafia guy. Some people, they buy something, they pay for it, even though it was liened. You won't be able always to get it out of their hands. A mafia person, a person who has the koyach to stand up against the courts, and he won't give in. And don't forget, he's not a ganef. He's saying, I bought land, the lekeach. I bought the land, here's the document, I paid from it, I'm not giving it up. There is also such a possibility. So if it's a psychological thing that the lender is not going to fully rely on the ox because he knows the ox can run away, the ox can be eaten up, the ox can be stolen. Well, the creditor also, l'chu'ura, will never really rely on a land because maybe the land will end up in the possession of a Baal Zeroya. The Gemara says, no, it doesn't work that way. What the Amar Rab Yudan, the father of Rav Matanya, that the creditor knows, that's the beauty about land, that even if the lekeach is a Baal Zeroya, okay, so as long as the Baal Zeroya is alive, or even better, as long as the Baal Zeroya is on top of his game, when he has the koyach, I won't be able to get it from him. But we are able to have patience. The land never goes away. And the wording of Chazal are beautiful. Mitsuyin hein Baal Zeroya lipol. At some point, even the powerful will fall down. Whatever is up is coming down. So yes, the creditor relies on getting his land back. Look at the Jewish people. It took us 2,000 years. We got our land back. Land you get back. So the creditor, when there is an apoitika, considers the land his. So it's not the borrowers to sell. Okay, one second. Now, again, we're focusing on Shitas Rabbi Yossi. So we wanted to give a raya, and now we're going to go ahead and have a kasha. Tani, we learned in a brayso, hakoisev soida poitike. whether it was leisha biksuvasa or whether it was lebal chayv b'chayvay. Braisa says befedish, and then the borrower or the husband sold that land that was designated for the debt. Hareze mechura, and and that's the whole word. It's a sale. When we tell a person that you did not do your due diligence, the lekech loses out. Halavai, the lekech gets the money back. But that's not the problem of the creditor. The creditor has that land. So befedish, the bottom line is the Braisa says, Harezu mechura. So how can Rabbi Yossi go against the Braisa? So the logic that we said yesterday will be applied over here. Rabbi Yossi doesn't need to find another Tana. It's not a machlokes Tanoim. It depends as to what type of an apoitika. Beautiful. Mas nisam. The Braisa that says Harezu mechura b'sha amar la, it's called an apoitika stam. Yehei l'chaperoin mizu. There is no, you may not collect from anything other than. No, this is for your collection. And apoitika stam is taka designated, but like we learned yesterday, since if the creditor wants, they can take their payment from another land belonging to the borrower. They're not bound to collect it only from this. That's why it's a sale. Ma pligin, where do we have the machlokes that we learned today between Avach and Rabbi Yossi is by an apoitik and mefaydesh bisha amar lo, that lo yehei loch pirayon. Loch is to the woman, right? If it's to ksubasisha, if it's to a male lender, lo yehei locha pirayon elamizu. Now, what's amazing, just to point out, is that Rabbi Acha holds that even by an apoitik and mefaydesh mechura l'sha. That's the chiddush. And why is that? I'll tell you why. Because cash. Because if the one who's chayiv the money, the borrower, the husband to the woman, if he'll give her cash, I think they might take it. But even when you make it an apoitik and mefaydesh, an apoitik means you'll get payment. It's like a guaranteed to payment. But cash is king. That's the logic. I'm talking about the logic of Rav Acha. There was a loan. If I lend someone money, I want money back. I'm not buying his land. Even when they make an apoitik and mefaydesh, I would rather don't pay me back cash and I'll get your land, even if I want your land. But a loan is still a loan. The money that a man owes his wife is not land. He owes her money for the ksuba. It's a money debt. That's Rav Acha. Rabbi Yossi says no. Since it's an apoitik and mefaydesh, it's already considered the property of the creditor, and therefore the sale is not a sale. Beautiful. Okay. Moving on. Next topic of today. Like we spoke about in the intro, as the Mishnah pointed out, the din of Shemitah is on a debt that originates from a loan. Ksubas Isha is not considered a loan, to make it clear. The woman did not lend any money. The Torah is machayev. I just want to say on the side, since many of us are involved in doing weddings, just to know, right? Remember the machlokes we had, whether a ksuba is d'oraisa or midrabanan? And like the Rambam says, ksuba is midrabanan. Problem is that the nusach of the ksuba is, we all know the nusach, many of us know the nusach. At some point you memorize it, right? The chazilachi midoiraisa by Epsula. Don't think that in the Rambam's ksuba, it didn't say the chazi lach midoiraisa. It said that was the same nusach. L'kula alma, I'm going to give you moihar. The concept of a man, I'll tell you better. The Rambam writes that the difference between a Nesuyin and a Pelegesh is a Pelegesh, which the Rambam is only mutter to a melech, just to make that clear. But a Pelegesh is a woman who's designated to be with one man, without Kedushin and without Ksuba. In other words, the definition of Nesuyin, even according to the Rambam, is a Ksuba. Even though the Rambam says Ksuba is midrabanan, must be that the number of 200 is not in the Torah. That's what he means by midrabanan. Le Rambam. The concept of giving something to her if he's going to divorce her or if he will predecease her, that's a doiraisa l'kula alma. We see it in the Torah. even though it's from before Matan Torah, Ein Lameidim Mikoyda Matan Torah, but it's a biblical concept. The ones who hold that the money of the ksuba is only midrabanan, it's the value of how much the Torah gave it, Masarah Liyat Chachamim. But anyways, coming back over here, ksuba begins as not as a choiv debt. Nevertheless, it's possible to transform the ksuba into a choiv. That was the whole Mishnah. It's possible to transform schar sacher into a choiv, right? It's possible. There are other debts the Mishnah spoke about. A storekeeper's credit could be made. It's called a haskafas milva. It stood up. It's transformed into a milva. How and when will a ksuba be transformed into a choiv? Machloik is between Rav and Rab Chia, and as we'll see, we have to get moving quicker in the Marav Fulda, that Rav later agreed with Rab Chia. At the end, there's no machloikis, even though it's not written here in the Yerushalmi. Rav holds there are two ways, an either or, and Rab Chia holds both. Let's read it inside. Rav Amar, one way that a ksuba will be transformed into a debt, and therefore it will become nullified or canceled by Shemitah, is pagma, even if loy zakva, which means, remember, a pagam in the ksuba? What happens when a man pays part of the ksuba? We're speaking about a man, guys, halkop, not a man who's married. Of course, Shemitah is not meshamet, a choiv, that's not even a choiv yet. We're speaking about a man who divorced his wife or who he predeceased his wife before Shvius. That's what we're talking about. And therefore, you might have thought, Shvius comes, so it's meshamet that debt. No, it's not. But what happens if the man or the heirs paid her part of the ksuba? That's called they were poigim the ksuba. So how do we view the remaining part of the money that wasn't yet paid? L'Rav, just paying part, not only does it mean that you can't use the ksuba as the proof of payment because she's already being moida, she's poigim it, it's not fully owned, right? That opens up a whole parsha. She'll have to prove how much was, the other people can claim we did pay the whole thing. She's already amoyde b'mixas over here. That's why it's a pegam. The moment you accept partial payment, we view the remaining of the payment into now a choiv, ke'ilu alone. That's one way that it's transformed into a choiv that will become canceled by Shemitah. Or option number two is zakva af al pishalei pegama. And that is when a woman agrees to convert the entire ksuba into a loan. Now, guys, I just want to follow again the rush. Like, how do you transfer something into a loan? I'll tell you how. When a woman comes to collect, and the man says, or the heir say, "We're not. Can you agree for us to pay you by echad, echad be'elul?" You push her off, and you say, "Listen, I'm not going to pay you now, but I'm going to pay you at that date." The moment you designate a later date for payment, from now until the later date, in other words, you're being moida, I owe you the money. Extend me more time. That makes it into a bona fide loan, even though she didn't give money, but she's taking a choiv that's owed and she's extending it. That's what she's giving. She's extending that. She's agreeing to the extended date line. That's the rush. So either by extending a date, or the fact that she took partial payment, even if no one spoke about a date for the remainder, that in itself made it into a choiv of a loan, and now Shemitah is meshamit. That's Rav. We learned in the Brayso Rab Chia holds you need to have both. For a ksuba to be transformed into a bona fide loan debt, both tifkoim and v'sigskoif. You have to have both. And without both things happening, we will always view the ksuba as a ksuba debt, which a ksuba debt is not a loan debt, and a ksuba debt, therefore, won't be canceled by Shvi'is.
So according to Rav, let's just say the Yerushalmi owe the wife, I don't know, $10,000.
Yep.
So they put her they give her $1,000 and they're going to pay her every month. Because they're paying her out over time, it automatically converts to a loan, and now Shemitah would knock it off?
I'll tell you, even according to Rab Chia, if they pay your part and the remaining is designated their payment dates, then it becomes a bona fide debt. because the woman had the right to tell the heirs or the ex-husband, I'm not accepting getting paid out. You owe me the money now. It's because he's asking of the ex-wife, give me something, which is give me time. She's giving it. That's called a loan. She's loaning him the time. Ki'ilu. Now look inside the end of the Marafulda for people who remember this whole sugi in the Bavli. 3 lines from the bottom of the Amid. V'rav atzmai nam isfira lekein, like Rab Chia. Where do we find this? Repetitive basic git in Bavli daf Yud Ches. So there's a stira b'shitas Rav for people who remember. So says the Marafulda ve'efsher that basar the killed Rab Chia savar. In other words, see that's the thing. Yerushalmi was written prior, even though the Yerushalmi was written in the life of Rav. Rav was alive then. At some point later, when Rav heard what Rab Chia said, he agreed to him. So the Yerushalmi quotes Rav with Tifgoim and Vesiskoiv. Let's move on weiter. Chavra daf pei omid beis. It's mamish fascinating. Okay, the big topic again. This is something that you read the Mishnah. I know we learned the Mishnah. I did not learn ahead. It was obvious. There's a problem. The problem is like this: when we speak about a storekeeper's credit, which is a common thing, the Mishnah gave us rule number 1, premise: a storekeeper's credit is not called a loan, even though you can say otherwise, right? I gave you the milk and you owe me the money. It's not viewed that way. It's just, and therefore Shvius is not Meshame. However, the Tanakama says the words that if I saw a milveh, then it becomes a choiv of a loan. And again, let's go with the Rush today. And that means that if the storekeeper tells the chevra, the household, guys, you got to pay me. And they say, listen, do me a favor, give me another 2 weeks. They ask for an extension. And the storekeeper gives them the extension, just giving them a later date, according to the Tanakama, that makes it into a loan. Shvius is Mishamet. However, Rabbi Yehuda said the words Harishain Rishain Mishamet. So what we said was, again, the psychology is that storekeepers, again, I know that it could be that today the world is different, but storekeepers, the way the world worked with the times of Chazal, you would not extend a family credit more than once. You don't do that. There's a credit, take the credit, pay up. If they extended it a second time, that's because in the mind of the storekeeper, it's no longer a credit. It's a chayv. I'll agree for this to be a debt. All of us have these experiences. With the same person, you want something twice. They say, I already gave it to you once. And you claim with them, no. Let's put what happened, let's put it on the side. Let's make that into a separate thing. It's called Harisha and Risha and Mishamet. Now the problem is, whether you follow the Tanakama, whether you follow Rabbi Yehuda, how are you to make sense of the case the Mishnah gave about a butcher who used to be the shoichet, who used to be the owner of the animal, that distributed animal pieces to customers on a day that they thought was Rosh Hashanah? Again, we are going that let's go with everyone. That's Rabbim, right? That when is Shvi'is Mishamet at the end of the 7th year. Okay, so you are at Chavtas Elul. Chavtas Elul, if there was money owed, then Shvi'is is Mishamet. If the Choiv began Echad B'Tishrei on the 8th year, then the Shvi'is is not Mishamet. It's already the 8th year. So that was the case of the Mishnah, right? It sounded wonderful. You gave out the meat. Turned out, so you gave out the meat Echad Rosh Hashanah. But if later we discovered that day was not made into Rosh Hashanah, which happened because no Eidim came, comes out that even though people kept Yom Tiv, but that day is Lamed Elul. The meat was given out on Lamed Elul. Oh, so since the meat was given Lamed Elul, now that debt doesn't have to be, the whole Chayv is canceled. Why? That's the question. Why? Okay, it was Lamed Elul, but this is a storekeeper's credit. This is a butcher giving out meat. Why would Shvi'is be Meshamet? It's not a loan of money. So the Gemara's answer, before we read it inside, is that it must be that this part of the Mishnah is Shitas Rabbi Yehuda. What is Shitas Rabbi Yehuda? We don't say that there has to be a collection and then there has to be a date given. You have to make it into a milva explicitly. No. Rabbi Yehuda holds Harishain Mishamet, which means that if the storekeeper extended one more credit, one more transaction to that buyer, the first one becomes automatically into a loan. It must be that the case of the Mishnah is that on that day, on the day that they thought was Rosh Hashanah, by Talmud Elul, he gave the meat. And then an hour later, they needed to get another product. They got fish, they got eggs, they got mashke, they got wine. Must be. That's why the meat now was canceled. The Mishnah doesn't have to say it because it was already said in the Reisha. Self-understood. Let's read it inside. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Arishain. No, it's the Gemara is not focusing if this Girs is correct. The kasha is on the case of the Rosh Hashanah. That's the kasha. The answer is going to be that part of the Mishnah is not like the Tanakama that if aso milva. No, Rabbi Yehuda says Harishon Ishain. You don't have to even address the first debt. The moment there's another purchase, automatically the first one becomes into a choiv of a loan. Umipnei shu makav leipam sheniyam. Nasis Rishoina Milva. The way I understand this is not a kasha. This is just an explanation, a fact, or a interpretation. What's the meaning of a Rishon Mishamet? Like we explained psychologically, people don't usually extend credit to someone who still owes them money. I know this as a fact. You think about a normal loan. If I lend you money before you pay back, it's not so common that I'm going to lend you money again. Normally, so store credit, whatever it is that you're doing, you want the first to be closed before you open up a number two. Many people do it. They borrow money from one, and then they pay back one by borrowing money from B, and then they go back to the first one to borrow money. That you get away with that because the first debt was closed. That's Rabbi Yehuda. People don't usually extend store credit to someone who has an open tab. The fact that he opened up a second tab is because it's self-understood that the first tab is closed. How is it closed? Yeah, because it's no longer store credit. It became a choiv, became a loan. That's what he's saying. And therefore, Amar Rabbi Lazar, now you chop the case of the Rosh Hashanah and the meat is the Rabbi Yehuda. Okay. But there's still a problem. Problem is that why even Rabbi Yehuda, l'chu'ura, when do we say that Harishon Nishon Mishamet, that if the storekeeper gives a second store credit, that's because the first store credit was closed? The Gemara's kasha is l'chu'ura, that's because he could have collected the money. It was a day in which money could have been collected. That doesn't go on Rosh Hashanah. And yet he didn't give the money. He could have closed the store credit, but he didn't store the closed credit, and he wants now a second store credit. But I'm not sure. So like we explained, so it was made into a choiv. This is a store credit, and that's a loan. But l'choida an Yom Tiv, that logic should not exist. L'choida. V'ro l'tovi b'Rosh Hashanah frekti Gemara. That should not apply in a Yom Tiv. Can't collect a debt on Rosh Hashanah. So this. Or another way of wording it. Let me say another angle of the Gemara's kasha. The Torah says, we learned this yesterday in the same pasuk, shamoit. Shamoit is the positive commandment of, let's say, cancel the loan. And the pasuk also has the lav of lo yigois. On Yom Tiv, it's not shayach to collect. So if the lo yigois is irrelevant, because it's Yom Tiv. You can't collect because it's Yom Tiv. So then the Shamoit should not go into effect. Another way of learning the Gemara's kasha. And the Gemara's answer will be that you can't say even on Yom Tiv that it's not shayach to collect. Why is that? Rabba b'shem Rab Ze'era mikivin shuhu ro'oi lahaminoi ro l'tavoi. We do say you can't collect money b'poil on Yom Tiv. But you can trust someone on Yom Tiv. You can allow someone to pick up merchandise from you on Yom Tiv if it's oichel nefesh, like the cases over here. It's amazing. So if you can extend trust, it's ki'ilu, you can extend payment. Trust and payment is very much linked over here. Your commitment to pay, which is what trust is something that could be done on Yom Tiv. Gewaldig. And therefore, it does work even on Yom Tov. That what? Umikivin shura l'tavoi. Ra'u l'tavoi. Is kemi shura l'tonin mois. Gewaldig. So the same psychology that we say, L'shitas Rabbi Yehuda, on a non-Yom Tov day, that a storekeeper doesn't usually extend credit to someone who still owes payment. You don't do that. The fact, and the case of the Mishnah must be that after the meat was given, another item was given, not together, later, an hour later. So we say the same concept, that the fact that the storekeeper gave to the same Yid some other product on what turns out now to be Lamed Elul. So yes, that's because the first meat already became a chayv, and now that we found out that it was on the Soif Shana, it wasn't Echad B'Tishrei, it was Lamed Elul. Now, unfortunately for the butcher, he can no longer collect. The Khan. I do want to say one thing which is important, and that is that even though you can't pay on Yom Tiv, you know what you could do on Yom Tiv? When people do this, I'm telling you, people do this, and that is they can give collateral. There is that. There's many ditim that we learned when we learned the sugya in Bavli. It happens. It's not that uncommon. It's uncommon, I think, for a balabas, for a shul, or for people that are real machnise yoidach. People can run out of food, and sometimes it's fully trust. It's nemanus, and sometimes the person goes to a store. They don't go through the main entrance. There's a lot of marasayin. You're going through the alley, and you take something without properly counting it, and no money is discussed. But sometimes the storekeeper will tell him, leave something, and you'll get it back after Yom Tov when we make the cheshbon.
Or if the store owner has taken a partial payment at any time, everything becomes a debt.
Very good. So Kavan is asking a great question. Let me go back L'shitas Rav. L'shitas Rav. L'chu'ura. I'll agree with L'chu'ura that just like Rav says, that when you're poigim de ksuba, which means when you take partial payment, that automatically makes the remaining part of the payment into a bona fide chayv. So he's asking, what happens, I say, to the storekeeper? L'chayda, the same thing. Before Rav changed his mind. Let's say if my family owns the store, they own $1,000. Because we bought are we kidding? We bought 4 bottles of milk. We'll owe $1,000. And I go ahead and I pay him $500. L'chayda, according to Rav, the other 500 becomes a chayv. L'chayda, I would say yes. I don't think Suba Sisha is different. Okay, let's go back. We have enough time. At least let's begin. I want to have 2 minutes. The words of Rabbi Yossi, as we quoted in the intro, has to be explained. No, it's number one. Schar sachir, like Suba Sisha, is not a loan debt. Not a loan debt. Shvius is not meshamit. Which means, let's go into tachlis. A worker worked for me, and I did not pay them, which is wrong, but I did not pay them. That work ended before the 7th year went out. They finished the work on Chav Ches Elul, or even on Chav Tes Elul. I should have paid them, but I didn't pay them. Now comes Shvi'is, not Meshamet. Says Rabbi Yossi, depends. That if it's a malacha that's Poisekes b'Shvi'is, then Shvi'is will be Meshamet. What does that mean? 2 approaches. And again, let's just at least get in what we already learned when we learned the Mishnah. So when Rabbi Yossi says the words Kol malacha shi Poisekes, then Shvi'is will be Meshamet. Right? Shvi'is Meshametes, Eino Poisekes b'Shvi'is, he spoke on both sides, Eino Meshametes. Number one way of understanding it, Rabbi Yechanan, which is what we learned in the Marafulda, we're speaking about a type of work that may not be done on Shvi'is. Going, for example, Charisha, how ironic. If you remember, in the Mamish, we're already coming to the end. In the beginning of the Masechta, we pointed out that in Parshas Bahar, the Torah does not say not to plow. The Rambam writes plowing is not a tulda. The Rambam writes that Charisha is asin midoidai. So don't forget that in Shvi'is, the tuldais are the Rabbanans. In Shabbos, tuldas doiraisa. It's the Rabbanan. Now, where did we get to the Rabbanan? If you remember that in Parshas Kisisa, right, Becharish ubekatzer tishbois, that pasuk. So we had a machlokes between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Yishmael, whether it's Shabbos, whether it's Tosefes, but if you can't even be Chodesh prior to the Shvi'is years, Avadanisht. Anyways, the example the Gemara gives is Charisha. And the logic we already explained, and that is like this, that any type of work that is allowed to be done on Shvis, even when the worker, who's a day worker, finished the work on Shavtes, the worker is hoping that the balabas will hire him again after Yontif on what's it called? On some Gedalia. In other words, the worker will not demand payment. That's the psychology. A worker will not demand payment when the worker has hope he's going to get more work, which means it's not closed yet. That will be what Rabbi Yossi is saying. But if he's doing work, he's doing Charisha and Avada Ezriya and Ketzira Kedarkoi, something that the worker knows he will not be rehired anymore because now it's the Shvi'is here. By the way, clearly you see from here, we're talking about the end of the 6th going into the 7th. Avada. Good chap. That's a raya to the Rosh. No, since he knows he won't get rehired to do this work, because it's usher to do that work on Shvi'is, so when the worker finished his job, the money is owed. Rabbi Yossi says if the money is owed because it's closed, the avoida ended, we're not counting new hours, now payment has to be given. If you don't give payment, you owe a chayv. Ironically, that chayv now is cancelled. Ulahoyer, the Rebbe has a gewaldige word. You know, when the Torah says that lo yisalen schar sachir, we have a rule that's schar b'hayal meleka. The Rambam says that, of course, Hashem, during the work, Hashem has to give us what we need to do our work. There's no schar in olam hazeh. That's the whole word, because the tab is not closed. Because as long as we are living, no one should convince themselves they accomplished. What you did yesterday, good for you. There's work to be done. If there's work to be done, payment is not due yet. And that was the whole word of the Rebbe, that even Moshiach is not payment. This is not demanding schar. Schar is for another time. We're not looking in for schar. But the work is Mashiach. In order for us to do our job, we need to have Mashiach. We need to have a Beis HaMikdash. We need to be able to keep all of the mitzvahs. Beautiful. That's Rabbi Yechanan, and God willing, tomorrow we'll